I'm going to proceed with the first demonstration here. Basically, what I'm going to do after each segment is do a little demo on how you can use the skills that we have just gone over to make something, either an object or a scene, in Blender. I won't be doing too much lecturing or talking or narrating over this part, as it's mostly just to watch and follow along. I will, of course, have my key strokes being captured down in this bottom corner so you can follow along with what I'm doing. But this part is just for demonstration. Follow along or use those skills to make something of your own. But without further ado, let's get started. So I'm starting from this default Blender scene. When you open it up, you have a general template. So the first thing I'm going to do is just select the camera, delete, and light, delete. Just because we're not going to be using them, so they're a little bit in the way. And actually, I think I'm going to delete this cube as well. I think I'm going to start with a different object. So to add an object, in the empty viewport, just press Shift A, Mesh. Let's start with the cylinder. Alright. Now, this is largely just going to be a function of what do we want to make with this. Thinking of making maybe like a little scene, so like a cartoonish scene. So let's start with this. Let's make a tree. Let's press 1 and let's move this up so that the bottom is sitting on this x-axis line. Now, this is going to be our trunk, but it's a little too thick at the moment, so we're going to make this thinner but not shorter by pressing S, hitting Shift Z to lock the Z value axis, and scaling it in. That's pretty good. Maybe it should be a little bit taller though, so we're going to press S, Z to scale only the Z axis, and just correct so it's sitting on the ground again. Alright, so this is a pretty good trunk. So now we wanted some sort of rounded, bulbousy branch clusters, sort of like you'd see in the background of a cartoon. So to do that, let's hit 1 to go into front orthographic mode, just because it's going to be a little bit easier to work with. So we can either add the spheres here, or we can Shift right click to move the 3D cursor closer to where we want them. Of course, it's not going to be exact using this method. Now we can press Shift A, UV sphere. Alright, and now what we're going to do to make this part is just kind of scale these, make it a little bit smaller. And then now I just hit 3 to go into right orthographic because this is scooched a little bit farther forward than I would like it. I want it to be as close as I can to sitting exactly on top of this cylinder. So we're going to press G for grab. We're going to move it just so this center edge that you can sort of see here is lined up fairly closely with this axis line. It doesn't have to be exact. It is organic after all. So now, to make this a little bit more tree-like, we're going to scale Z, and just flatten this out just a touch. Now, I don't really want these facets, so on any of this actually. So I'm going to click this first sphere and click this, shift click I should say, to select all of it. I'm going to right click and press shade smooth. So now when we duplicate from these objects, the objects that we duplicate off of them will be smooth as well. Of course, I'm just duplicating by selecting it and pressing Shift and D and moving it out. So now it's just kind of a matter of arranging these objects so that they look somewhat sort of tree-like. Okay, that's looking fairly tree-like. It's enough for our purposes right now. Maybe scale these in a little bit more at the top so it has more of a tapered kind of look. But let's say we're happy with this tree. Looks pretty good. So now I want to make this one object. So I'm going to just, with the box select enabled up here, I'm going to click and drag. And if I join this right now, you'll remember from the lecture that this will be its new pivot point, which is not really ideal for what we want, because we're going to want to move this around next. So with all these selected, if I just hold shift and press the one that I do want to be active, meaning the trunk here, it's going to make that one active. So now I can just press Ctrl J, and now we have a whole single object. So when I move it around, it smooths all together. It's called cylinder up here. Let's name it tree. Okay, now trees rarely grow alone, so let's move it along the ground here, and we're going to start duplicating it by pressing Shift D. We're going to rotate it around the Z axis to give it sort of a more random appearance so they don't all look like exact copies of each other, even though they are. We're going to make them slightly different heights. Actually, let's put these a little closer together. That's going to look better. And then, yeah, that looks good. We're just going to repeat that process until we have, well, maybe not a forest, but, you know, some nice trees growing in sort of clusters the way trees do. You can see some of these, because the pivot point is in the center, when I scale them up and down, they kind of shrink away from the ground. We'll go over how to move a pivot point in a future video, but for now, just place them back where they need to be. Hit Shift C to reset my camera because my cursor was distracting me floating up here. If the cursor is really distracting to you, you can always hide it, coming up here and unchecking 3D cursor. I recommend having it on in the beginning though, because you might get confused why your new objects are being added way out into the distance because you've accidentally shift and right clicked somewhere. So Shift C again to return that. Okay, we have some trees. They're looking pretty good. Let's put an actual ground for them to sit on so they're not just sort of floating amorphously onto this grid. I'm going to do a plane for the ground, which is just a flat surface. So Shift A, add a plane. And for this one, this is just going to be one surface. So we're going to scale it up real big. Now it looks like they're actually sitting on the ground. Alright, what should we add next? Let's add some, I don't know, bushes? I'll probably do that with the sphere as well. You can see when I hit 1 to go into a front orthographic, the plane disappears. It's just because it has no thickness to it, so when you're viewing it exactly from the side, you can kind of see it in this line because we're still in perspective, but it's just because there's no thickness, so you're just viewing basically a two-dimensional line when you go exactly into orthographic mode. It's still there. Okay, probably not the most convincing shrub you've ever seen, but I think it gets the job done. So I want to join these together and make it a single object, but now when I box select, it's going to select this plane as well. In order to avoid this, so that this isn't joined to the plane, just deselect by clicking off of any mesh here, select only the plane, press H to hide it. You'll see it kind of goes dim here in the outliner. Now we can box select all of these. The plane will not be selected. We can choose which one we want to be our active. Let's just say this one. Press Control J and join it. And now this is one object. Let's rename it Shrub. And you'll see that I've renamed the tree, and since I did that before I started duplicating it, it's maintained that name with the numbering suffix across all of these duplicates here. You can also rename this one over here, ground. Okay, so let's start placing some of these. Oops, with only the shrub selected. Make it a lot smaller. What you'll notice I just did is that I had duplicated this object and I moved it, and it kind of sank below in my process of moving it, but with it still lined up, if you press Shift Z to lock the Z axis, it'll snap it exactly to where it was on the Z over where your cursor currently is. So you can always select it, Shift D to duplicate, and like say you want it in front of this tree, but it's like lifting up and down off the ground, you can hit Shift Z and then move it, or you can move it and then press Shift Z to snap it back up to the plane. Alright. Alright, what else should we add to this scene? Maybe some rocks. Some of these trees are a little short, maybe. Can get some more dynamic differences in the sides of these. And we can also scale these whole things up by a single axis if we wanted to make it sort of a different shape. We can just, it allows us to get a lot more variation in these objects without having to actually model completely new ones. We didn't really go over this object. It's not one that I use all that often. It is a sphere, but instead of having, let me pull up a UV to show you. Oops. Instead of having these sort of square faces on it, it has triangles, and we'll get into why this matters a little bit more later on, but it just gives it a sort of different look. So I've been using the UV spheres up until now because I wanted these to be pretty smooth, but if I'm thinking like rocks, you want it to be kind of jagged, so using only the skills that we've learned so far, I think an icosphere might make a better rock. You'll notice for these rocks especially, I'm letting them just kind of stick through the ground here. And it's another good reason to have a plane is that you can use the plane essentially to hide all this stuff. So with a single rock model, we can use the transform tools to really get like a wide variety of different looks from the same, what is essentially the same piece. That trick is used a lot, especially like in games where you'll have, you know, you don't necessarily want to model 100 different types of rock, but you may need them all to look different. Otherwise, it just looks strange in the scene. So, you know, you make 3 or 4 rocks and you use your transforms and you clip it into the ground and the landscape meshes. So they appear to be different even though they are the same. All right, what should we do now? Add some like buildings of some sort. Add a little more interest into this. Let's make this roughly like building sized. Something more like that. Just to make it a little bit more clear that it's like a building, we can add some more meshes to represent like windows and doors, things like that. This isn't really how I would construct a building unless I was going for this visual style really specifically, but using only adding and transforming objects, this is how you would do it. So like maybe that's a door. I'll make these windows a little bit shorter. Duplicate them along the axis so they're in like a nice row. Maybe make this like that. Could put maybe the door off to the side a little, just so it's a little more dynamic looking. I feel like this window should be smaller. Probably most windows line up pretty well with doors, so they're not like crazy higher or lower. Could I scale some of these in a little bit and make them a little bit more realistically sized? Let's just make these. I'm gonna add a doorknob to this just to give it a little more definition. So I can do that by shift right clicking to put the cursor there just so it adds it in the right spot. Oops, do X 90 to flip it around this way and then scale. We're going to scale it all down the same way. That looks pretty good. It probably should be a little bit thinner. Oops, I meant to do scale shift Y to lock the length. Maybe a little bit shorter. And then just to make sure these are lined up, again, hit 3 to go into orthographic, and you can see that there's a little gap here behind it. So just grab it along the Y and move it in. And it's okay at this stage, especially if your meshes are like intersecting into one another. That's totally fine. Oops. You see my sort of zoom got all messed up there for a minute, so I pressed Shift and C to return it to sort of this default view. This door's probably a little thick. Can scale it in, move it out, move these ones back into it, and just make sure that everyone, since we don't know how to separate parts of a mesh from each other yet, just make sure everything is really where you want it before you join objects. We're going to go over how to separate like these pieces from each other once they're already joined, but that's for a future video. For now, we're just practicing adding and transforming. You see, I forgot to shade this smooth, and that's really going to bother me, so I'm just going to undo out of that until they're separated. Shade smooth, and then make sure these are placed right where you want them. It could be probably shorter and thinner. Okay, let's not focus too much on this. I'll get distracted. Cool. So now when we look at it, oops. And you'll notice when I have this selected, the camera sort of rotates around the whole thing. When I have a smaller piece selected, the camera is rotating around my selection. And this is something Blender does just by default. So if you're ever wondering why your camera is not rotating kind of the way you want it to, it's probably because you have something selected that shouldn't be for your purposes. Let's give these some like window like frames so that they're a little more easy to see in our scene. Shift X to make it thinner. X. Hit 1 so that we can see exactly how this is scaling. We're just going to line these edges up as best we can with these edges here. And these aren't going to be very exact because we're not actually into editing individual meshes. But again, purposes of practice and demonstration, this works just fine. But we definitely can make these more exact when we know how to do more in Blender. This nice sort of frame. So you'll see if two faces are occupied in the same space, Blender doesn't really know how to draw them, so you'll see this sort of flickering happening. This is called Z fighting. It just means that you need to offset these slightly because two objects cannot be located, I should say, in the same physical space. It just doesn't make sense. See it down here too, but we've already scaled the top one, so let's just duplicate that across the Z-axis. It's like a nice little window frame. You'll see that these aren't Z-fighting anymore because I actually have this ever so slightly indented here. You can see it right here. If this were exactly, which I'm not even sure if I can place it that exactly on top, it would cause that Z-fighting. But when you can still have meshes that intersect each other without that, you just need to offset them really slightly like that. A pretty good window. Okay, let's join this together by shift clicking all of the parts, and then we just want to make sure that the original window is last because I want it to have this as its pivot point. You can also go inside meshes in Blender. I mean, there's nothing really in here, but you can do it if you just rotate your camera and zoom it. You can view the inside of this building now. And delete those because it's easier to just duplicate this. And just a quick note, you'll see that when I pop into front orthographic view, you really can't see these little panes and frames that I've added anymore. And that's just because it's having a hard time showing you in this mode because this face is perfectly flat. So it's the same principle as viewing your cube. From orthographic mode, we can no longer see the sides of it. But if you're working like this and you've noticed that, you know, it starts to get hard to see what you're doing, there's a really quick way that you can visualize this better. You just come up to here where these view modes live, and we'll talk a little bit more about these in the future. But right now we're in solid mode, which basically is just going to render everything here as this sort of flat gray color, which makes it sort of hard to see when you're dealing with a lot of objects that are overlapping with each other. So in order to get a little bit clearer picture, we're just going to hit the drop down here and come down here to where it says cavity and enable that. And it's a pretty slight difference, but it sort of just draws black into these inner sort of shaded areas, and it draws a white edge along these outer edges, and it just enables us to see it a little bit easier. You can also duplicate more than one object at once with just all the objects you want selected. Same thing as duplicating a single object, just press Shift D, and then if you want to move it along a specific axis, you can do that. Shift D, move. It's pretty cool, huh? I'm just eyeballing these placements. I'm not using any sort of exact measurements at this point. We can get like, oh, I don't know, some like stepping stones or like a path along here. That'd be kind of cool. Trying to think if I should do this with the icosphere to match these rocks or a cylinder to make it more like paver stones. And this is just largely a personal choice of the design you want. Let's just stick with the icospheres. It gives it sort of a nice faceted look, whereas the cylinder tops will just look quite flat. Let's see. So this is what I'm talking about with like folders being very handy, and you can see I've already started to forget to name things here, but we're going to start organizing this scene so that we can more easily manipulate these objects as we need them. So let's make a new collection. Click, and we're going to name it like tree. So we're going to put all these tree objects into it. So we can do that by finding them all here and just dragging them, or you can shift click them all to select. And then we can hit M on our keyboard to move. And we can select the collection we just made or make a new one right here. But we're good. We already made one, so we're going to put that right here. So now that all these trees are organized into one folder, if I'm trying to make like a garage door or something, like right here. So I can, you notice when I go into front orthographic, like this stuff is sort of in my way. So we're just going to temporarily hide that by going to the trees collection, and on the collection, hitting the I there, and it will just collapse all those things. So really quick, let's just make folders for all these object types. Like I mentioned before, no two objects in Blender can have the same name. The program just can't handle that. So I've just named this one window. And now if I select this one and try to name this one window and hit enter, you'll see that it automatically adds that numbering suffix for me because it recognizes that there's already a window in this scene. Oops, that's a good spell. 0.002, 003, and so on. And this would have been much faster if I had named the first one properly and then just duplicated it, but I forgot to do that, so now we have to pay. Okay, now we can get back to this. Now everything's named and organized, and except for some of these rocks here. Let's not call this rock, let's call this stepping stone, that's what it is. So we can also double click and then hit Control copy to copy this when it's highlighted. Control V, and I'll speed it up. Alright, now everything's named nicely. Okay, let's get back to working on this piece. In fact, before I forget, let's just name it. I'm going to try to make it like a garage door. Which might actually make more sense on this side. If you're thinking like design-wise, you'd want space for cars to pull in on and have this be the longest side, but I digress. Let's Control 3 to view the left side. Actually, I changed my mind. We're going to leave it right there. And these buildings look kind of plain at the moment, so we can just add a little bit more definition by adding more cubes to it. So rather than adding a new cube, because I'm going to add some like columns and things to the side just to make it a little bit more defined. So I find it's easier when something's already sort of the dimension that you want it, at least in one or two of those dimensions. It's just easier to duplicate it, move it, and then change the dimension that is not the one you want. So because it was already the correct height in the Z, by duplicating this and scaling it in the X and Y, it's now exactly the same height as this and in the right location. Oops, before we do that, let's name this like column, just just to make our lives a little bit easier. Try to line this up fairly so that this dot is sort of lined up semi-accurately with these corners. And like, you'll notice that there's still some Z-fighting happening here because this is the exact same height as I just described. But you also have to think about like, how much of this are you really going to see? Is this going to be covered with more objects? Is it going to be not viewable from the camera angle? And if that's the case, it's totally fine to leave it. Oops, shift. You'll notice in Blender, which is really nice, is that if you select something and like shift select and you're like, oh, let's say I wanted this, this, and this, but I accidentally selected this and this, you can hold control, do control Z will undo your selection also. So if you're like selecting a lot of objects and then oops, you select that one, instead of having to undo it and then like reselect all of these, you can just hit undo and it will undo your latest selection so that it will maintain this selection here. It's really nice. A lot of programs don't consider selection to be, you know, an operation that way that Blender does. That's pretty good. So you'll notice that the way I'm doing these, I'm duplicating it and then I'm lining this green dot up to where I want it to be, because remembering that this is the pivot point, so this point's never going to move based on a, you know, a rotation operation or something like that. So when I rotate it by 90, it's pretty close to where I need it to be already. And then it's just about fine-tuning that placement. D and then X. It's not looking too bad. Kind of looking like, I don't know, maybe an apartment building or something. And I tend to make my models, and it depends on the scene you're working on for sure, but I tend to find it's easier to model things on the origin point because it's just sort of a default and it makes sure you don't have any sort of wacky values in here. I find it's easier to model things and then move them, but you are totally welcome to model them in place. You'll see, you know, some of these I've been modeling in place, like the windows and whatnot. That is just a matter of personal preference. Oops, scale, Y. That's way too big. I'm trying to make this like a mailbox. So yeah, you'll notice when we have multiple things selected and even though these aren't joined, if I scale these, they're scaling together because I have them both selected. Smooth this out a bit. I'm going to bring back some of our other models just to see how it's looking. It's pretty cool. But I feel like I started out with more of a nature scene, and this building doesn't really belong there, so let's reconfigure some of these things to make it look a little bit more cohesive as a scene. You can see that because I was in an orthographic view, this tree has started to float, so we're just going to snap it down to ground by being in front orthographic. So, thinking instead of this plane, we're gonna make this a little bit different. And this is just a design thing. It's not because of anything about, you know, using Blender that is being limited. So instead of like having just a flat ground plane, because this is starting to look more like a city building and not like, you know, a small house, I think what I'm going to do is make this more like on a sidewalk and maybe have the trees just as like fewer, and then like maybe just like the little city ones you know, have poking out of the ground sometimes, out of the little holes in the sidewalk. And then this is just a composition, sort of an art principle thing. Like you just tend to not want to have larger objects in the front because it's obstructing your view. So like this tree is a lot smaller than this one. So let's put this one in the back and this one in the front. It's just going to look better. And then also we want to make sure that like these aren't perfectly aligned when you're viewing it from the front, just because when you view it from the front it looks strange. So just offset it a little so you can tell that there's two trees there. Obviously, if you know the camera angle at which you're going to be viewing this at, if it's not, you know, for a game or something where it's live demoing, you know, you only have to model and make objects for that camera angle, but this is just more sort of a general model, so we're going to make sure it looks good on multiple sides. I don't think we're going to need these stepping stones, actually. Oh, and we didn't finish joining our mailbox together. J for join, and rename it. Now, you'll see that the objects I've added were added outside of a collection. It's just because we weren't in a collection. We didn't have one highlighted when we added it, so it just added it to the general scene collection. You don't need to have your objects in these subfolders like this, but it's just a really handy way of organizing it. We can always move it back to the original collection. Oops. Don't worry about that. I just pressed the button on accident. We're going to go over that feature next. Oops. See, like, both times I accidentally pressed Shift D and then I pressed X, but since I was in right orthographic, we don't see any movement on the X because we're looking at it from that direction. So it appeared like it wasn't doing anything, but actually it was moving it this way. So make sure, okay, so I do still have the duplicate. We're just going to grab it on the Y. That's what we wanted to actually do. See? Grab this back a little bit. Oops. I seem to have multiple duplicates. Just delete them. And that was just from me hitting Shift D a second ago a couple times. Make this street a little bit more narrow. It's like a shame to get rid of all these nice things that we made, so we're gonna like make maybe out here like a little green space for this apartment, a little courtyard or something. A little smaller. I'm not too worried about deleting these objects because these are all duplicates of each other, so as long as I keep one of them, I won't have to redo this work really too much at all. Again, let's put this taller one sort of in the back for sort of composition reasons. Make this one a little bit smaller. We probably don't need that one. Okay. Let's like further delineate that this is kind of a sidewalk. I do have an extra one here. Delete it. That and that. Grab them forward. How many of these do I have? Jeez. Okay. Sorry. Oh, let's see, how wide is a sidewalk typically from like the front of a building? I guess it depends where you are. This isn't like a skyscraper or anything, so we're going to give it a little bit of distance here. Oops. This is wireframe mode. We're going to go over this in a future video. I just hit the button by accident. If you do hit this button by accident, it's controlled with Z. If you accidentally get into this mode, all you have to do is hold Z, click back over to solid. But we'll go over that more in a future video. Let's make like a fence here to delineate this green space from this sidewalk. Let's do a cube. I'm trying to think of how tall like a fence like this might be. I mean, I guess it depends on the fence. This is a privacy fence. It would probably be at least as high as this door. Maybe a little lower. Again, not really caring that it intersects into this because when it's not selected, you can't really tell. If you want to spend time like lining these up very perfectly, you're of course welcome to do that, but I don't think it's necessary for the purposes of demonstration. Put some windows on this side. We're going to select this row of windows, duplicate the whole thing, rotate it on the Z by 90, and it's going to rotate all of these together, which is really nice. A little time saver. We need a couple more on this side. Oops, wrong axis. I do that a lot. You'll probably notice I hit X when I mean to hit Y, and vice versa, because, you know, when you're rotating around a lot, sometimes you get confused about which way you're facing. But no biggie, you can just cancel it, right-clicking, and it'll drop it back where it was, and you can do it properly. Oops, just did it again there. Because in my head I have it, you know, that X is left and right, and it is, but because we're on the side of this building here, I'm now thinking as left and right is moving these this way, but really it's moving it this way. Oops, that wasn't that, I just fat-fingered the keys there. The Z and X are right next to each other. Let's try to line these up with these heights as best we can. And give the impression that like the floors are actually there, even though, you know, when we go inside this mesh, there's nothing inside it. A lot of this is trial and error. It's just because I didn't really have, you know, a specific plan for what I was going to model for this demo. I'm just kind of trying out different things and seeing what looks good. It doesn't need one. And place it, and then rotate, and then when you're in orthographic, you don't have to define the axis. It assumes, because you're in orthographic, that you are going to want to rotate around this Y here. So you just go 90 without having to press the Y axis. Pressing the Y axis is fine. It'll still function. You just don't have to in this case. So you can go into top. I like top view for placement, just makes things easier. You can get a very clear view of what you're doing from a top-down perspective. That's pretty nice. I need like a chimney or something. A lot of roofs have like, you know, vents and things sticking out in them, so we're gonna add like some vents and things. I'm not going to worry too much about proportions on these, because this is sort of a cartoonish scene anyway with these trees, so it's okay if our proportions are a little large. Chain smooth. Let's add a little cone to the top of that. Oops. Once again, hit that by accident. Or not so much by accident, more by habit, but we haven't gone over that yet, so I will try to refrain from doing that as much as possible. I accidentally had the whole thing selected, so we're just going to undo that duplication and that selection. Make sure only that is selected. Now we can duplicate it the way we want. Let's add some like cubes for like to represent, you know, like air conditioning units and things like that kind of like stick out and give buildings like a more jagged profile. Let's put this one like kind of in the corner here, so it's like on the side of this building and on the top of this building. It's going to be more rectangular. It's probably a little too large. Let's scale that down and like make it a little shorter. Okay. Oops. Yeah. It definitely is starting to give more of an impression of like, you know, a modern sort of city rooftop. Let's like put one and like rotate it so it's more vertical. just to make it a little more interesting visually. Let's put some of these up on this one too. So the vents coming out of it, just to break up these shapes so they're not all identical. It's gonna look a little bit better. It's gonna look like smokestacks or something, but you get the idea. You're not really gonna think about the function of these that much when you're just looking at this piece, you know, as a whole. We need a door to get out here though. So right there, I duplicated this door in top view and moved it out so it was generally where we want it to be. But when I hit R and 90 to rotate it in the Z direction, you can see from the doorknob that it's flipped the wrong way. So in order to do that, you can just, even after you type in the value, just hit minus and it'll flip it around. Let's make these like double doors. Why not? So if I wanted to make this like a double door, I can do that by duplicating it across the Y, but we want to flip this doorknob so it's over on this side. And we can do this without having to remodel a separate door with the doorknob on the other side. We just click this, and remember that it's rotated already. So we're going to hit S for scaling it. We're going to hit Y to scale it this way. And you can see if you scale all the way in and flip it around, it's flipped around now. So this is denoted in 3D graphs by using negative values. So all you really have to do, if you want this perfectly a mirror of this one, hit scale, Y, minus 1. And that flips the doorknob around. This is looking pretty good so far. I wonder if we can add like street lights. Sounds like a good thing to have. Let's start with a cylinder. Shift Z to bring it in. And unfortunately for the keystroke capture that I have that appears down here, it doesn't tell you when it's shift. Like it doesn't say the word shift out here, but it will have it in capitals because it's, of course, you make a capital S is to do shift. So that's what the capital versus the lowercase is. It's just the capital means I've pressed shift with that key. Right, this needs to be taller by a pretty substantial amount. Something around that. Maybe that's a little too much. Get it from the side. Actually, let's just duplicate this. Again, I'm placing the origin of the object right here because that's where I want it to rotate around. Actually, I'm just going to hit R90, so it's exactly 90 degrees in this angle. Shift Y, make it a little bit thinner. And then if you want to quickly zoom in on any selected object, you can do so by selecting the object and hitting the period key on your numpad. You can see it's right there. That will frame your selection. So you can, you know, if you're way out here and you need to get quickly, oops, you just hit period. Of course, if you do not have a numpad on your keyboard, this won't work. It won't automatically rebind even if you have emulate numpad enabled. I had to manually go and rebind this to the regular period key on my keyboard. But we went over how to change key maps. although I guess we didn't really go over them, but all I did was go into Preferences, Key Map, type in Frame. Frame selected, numpad 0 is right there. Frame selected, you see I have it. It used to be numpad here. You just click this, and you press the key you want, and it'll bind it. Anyway, resuming with this. I guess for this shape, can't really, at this stage, we can't really make nice curves or anything in this because we're just working with primitive objects, but we are, in the next video, going to learn how to edit meshes so that they're more complex shapes than this. But for now, we're just practicing moving, scaling, rotating, and adding, and joining. I'm pressing Shift-C to reset it, just to move the cursor off of it so I can see how it looks a little bit easier. Might that be more appropriate? So remember to scale this along the local. So if I wanted to make this end here and here, I'm just trying to make it shorter, but I'm not really trying to change anything else. So just a reminder, hit scale and then double tap Y. Double tap, of course, Z, and it will scale it along its Z axis. And just remembering, fix our shading before we join them, because at this stage, we wouldn't know how to go in and fix it after the fact. That's not bad. That's pretty street light looking. Control J to join. Now, you might get some errors in your shading when you join objects. We're going to go over this type of stuff more later, but if this pops up like this, it's because I scaled these objects and I've joined it to an object that has a non-uniform scale. So its scale is 0.091 and 0.091 in the X and Y, and the Z value is 2.44, which is throwing off the way Blender shades this. So to fix this, yes, that will fix it. So click on the object, and then you're going to hit Control A to bring up this Apply menu. Go ahead and click Scale. We're going to go over more why that works in a future video, but for now, just know that if you have that wacky shading happening after you join an object, it's because your scale is not uniform, and Blender really doesn't like that. So you can see that after I join it, or I'm sorry, after I apply it, not that, it has 0.091 here, Control A, Scale, and now everything's set to 1, but the object itself hasn't changed. Alright, let's continue with this. We'll make them as even as we can, but don't stress too much about placement of things. Again, don't stress too much about anything at this stage. We're just starting out, and we're going to learn how to do a lot more complex stuff and get things a lot more exact. Oops. Of course, on the Y. Of course, I didn't rename any of these. My bad. F2 to rename, Control V, copy, paste, F2, Control V, paste. let's rename this one to street while we're here, because it's not really the sidewalk. Just rotate around the Z 180 by going into top, R 180. And actually, if we wanted to maintain this exact distance between them, instead of duplicating one, we're just going to duplicate them all. The same way we did with the windows. Place it R180. And because this distance and this distance are not equal, and it's flipped the whole thing around, it is shifted over, but we can, no biggie, just shift it a little bit back so they're more lined up. Cool. Probably need like a car or something in this scene. And actually, let's just shift this whole thing over so that the center of the street is the center of the world. No real reason, I think it looks a little bit neater. And, you know, when you start to get a lot of objects in your scene, staying neat can be pretty critical. Now, this car is not going to be a total masterpiece, just because a car is the shape of a car is just much more complex than we're able to do at this stage, but we're going to get a rough idea of it. It's RX90 to rotate it 90 degrees in the X. Let's place them a little better and then scale them so they're the right size. I'm going to leave this flat shading on here just because object shading is going to make it look, well, it actually looks okay, but we're still going to leave it at flat. Not too bad, considering that all we're doing is adding and not editing any of these. Maybe the world's a little thin, but it's fine. So I'm selecting these, keeping in mind that I want to select this body of the car last, because I want to maintain this point here as its pivot. And then just hit Control J. And now we have this as one object, which we can rename to car. I'm just going to go through some of these unnamed objects really quick and make sure that we name them, just to keep good habits. This vent 01. And we'll call this one vent 02. And then the ones that are based off of these same shapes, I'm just going to keep these the same names. So all the cube ones are going to be vent 01. And these ones with the little cone on top can be vent 02, which we only have one of right now, but we can add more if we like. And let's call anything that's like a cylinder with no cone, we'll call that vent 03. Control C to copy, F2, Control V for all of them to quickly rename. Alright, this is starting to look halfway decent. Let's do these cars. Well, we don't drive in the middle of the road. Or we can even have them like, maybe like they're parked on the side. That's fun. Maybe we want one to be like a like an SUV, so we don't want, you know, this trunk action happening, so easy to do. Same principle, adding a cube. And actually, I'm going to clear the transformation on one of these by pressing Alt-G. And so it's on top of the cube I've just added. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to make sure that these two different types of cars I'm going to make it scaled appropriately. But see, it's getting a little busy. So let's really quickly, before we start making this next thing, let's do a new collection. Call this like street. And we're going to add all these objects that are blocking my view of what I'm doing. I'm going to press M and move them to street. So now if I hide the whole collection, rogue rock. It's just a little bit easier to see. So for like an SUV, we want it to be a little bit bigger than our initial, or our first car, which is more like a sedan, yes. A little bit bigger, maybe not quite that tall, a little extreme. And then we can also move this back in the Y, so that it's not quite overlapping, and we can still see it in perspective mode, but then when we go to orthographic, it's still lined up, because we've only moved it in this one direction, which we're viewing it straight on. So yeah, maybe just ever so slightly smaller. And then we need to add like the hood part. So we're going to add another cube. Scale it. Make sure that it's scaled appropriately to the width of the car so that they match. And normally you wouldn't make an object like this using two primitives, so you wouldn't have to worry so much about like this inset, but we are just practicing the skills we learned, so it is best to just do it this way. Make these tires even a little thicker. And line them up as best we can. Duplicate, select both, duplicate along the Y. Okay, not a masterpiece again, but it certainly gives the impression of like a larger vehicle. So we're going to select all of the parts that make it up. Select the main part of the car to maintain this pivot. Control J. And rename it car 02, just to keep it simple. Which means this is a car, but this is going to be car 01 now because we have more than one kind. That's just how I tend to name things. It's not really any sort of absolute naming convention. It depends what you're working on, you know, the target platform for it and all that. So, and we can have, let's see, have these ones on this side because I am American and we drive on the right side of the road. So you'll see these going this way. All right, not too shabby so far. I'm not totally in love with this as a garage, so let's delete that and just make some more windows here because I think it's going to look better. Yeah, it looks better. It's like a nice, and again, if you want to put windows on every side of this and, you know, fix up some of these things in the back, you can totally do that. It depends, you know, what you're going to end up using these models for. So, like, if you're 3D printing something like this, you definitely want to make sure it looked good at all sides because it's going to print all sides and you're going to be able to see all sides of it. Similarly, if this were for like a video game, like a scene, like an environment, and, you know, if your character could get around to the back of these buildings, you want to make sure that these are finished. But if this is just going to be rendered as a still image, you can just leave it. We'll never see it. We'll never know.